Hello everyone, welcome to yours and my favorite part of the week. That's right, it is your online adulthood and aging psychology course, and I'm here to walk you through the hottest topics in social roles. So with that said, let's jump into it. Beginning with some basic definitions. Social roles, expected behaviors and attitudes that come with one's position in society. Quote, successful aging, a theory that younger individuals hold many roles, gradually shed over time, and measures how willingly they had been relinquished. Role transitions. Role changes due to changes in the individual in his or her life or circumstances. Roles are neither gained nor lost, they change as life circumstances change. Biological clock, change over adulthood in health and physical functioning. Social clock, person's sense of when things should be done and when he or she is ahead of or behind the schedule dictated by age norms. Change over adulthood in social roles. Time schedule of the normal sequence of adult life experiences. Off-time events may negatively affect development. So briefly walking through this, we have this idea of social roles, and this is kind of like an old school theory wherein kind of classic aging literature, wherein someone has X amount of resources and through time you just gradually lose them. So, if in this case you have X amount of social roles in society, and gradually over time you shed those roles, and kind of a measurement of successful development / aging is the extent to which those roles are willingly relinquished. This is kind of a decline, this understanding of social roles and kind of social transitions throughout life, the lifespan, to other theories, which include kind of role transition, wherein roles aren't gained or lost, however they change as life circumstances change. So you have a child, and maybe you get a new job, you become a grandparent, etc. So or your child leaves the house. So you have kind of different roles, different responsibilities that change due to life circumstances within the individual or kind of like their environment. Biological clock is kind of like all these kind of biological things, just kind of the classic changes at a biological level, in this case, health and physical functioning. And social clock is kind of this idea that everybody kind of has a sense of when certain things should be done, and if you're behind schedule or ahead of schedule. And then the idea here is that if you recognize that you're behind schedule or ahead of schedule, that's going to impact your developmental outcomes, either positively or negatively, because you're going to say, oh, I'm the best, I'm ahead of the game, or like, man, I'm trash, I'm like really behind in where I should be in life right now. The effect of variations in timing, social timing, roles we occupy, how long we occupy them, and the order in which we occupy them. They're dependent on culture, what expectations our society has for role transitions. Marriage at 35, on or off time. We have Bernice Neugarten. Her theory was individuals form a mental representation of normal, expectable life cycle. Individuals are able to compare past selves with their future selves and anticipate their future selves. And they're able to compare life cycles with other people's life cycles. Jet Heckhausen, people off time in social clock, lower levels of life satisfaction, correlations between social roles, sequence, norms, and stress. Okay, so kind of briefly reviewing this, social timing, again, roles we occupy, how long we occupy them, and the order which we occupy them, and they're dependent on culture. So we kind of have all these mental representations of milestones, which obviously depend on culture, and it depends on the historical era that you live in, and we'll talk about that later on in different slides. But kind of the idea, for just a simple demonstration, the idea of marriage before 21 years old, for example, being that expectation was reflected in the rates of marriage prior to an individual turning 21 or 22 years old, 100 years ago versus today, where those numbers are vastly different. And that reflects changes, a historical change, and that historical cultural change, which reflects all these other things going on, and kind of the political, economic, and social levels. Therefore, kind of an individual who is unmarried at, say, 28 in 1900 versus an individual who's not married at 28 in 2022, those are you're going to have two different kind of sets of evaluations, because the expectations in that historical era and that culture are different for that that role transition, and that role transition specifically being marriage. And then we kind of have two kind of theories here of variations in timing and social role transitions. With the first, Bernice basically kind of this is almost like a cognitive argument here, is that as individuals age, you have a better understanding of kind of quote unquote who you are, and but you're ultimately able to form kind of abstract representations of things and compare yourself to your present self to your past self, and then kind of your future goals, which like a 5-year-old can't do, for example. So kind of that. But with that ability, that mental representation ability, comes kind of expectations of where you should be in life, and therefore you can compare yourself to others. And then finally, Heck-Hausen theory is basically that there's, for individuals who are off time, behind schedule, that leads to a kind of overall lower life satisfaction, and there's a correlation between social role sequence, so kind of being off timing or doing things maybe out of order, norms and stress. So kind of feeling behind, and then with being correlated with increased stress, which then is correlated with all these potentially correlated with all these negative developmental outcomes across adulthood. And I've actually done a lot of research on this, kind of my research in kind of big kind of shifts at the macro and chrono level, and how those shifts in an environment can kind of lead to different developmental paths, and placing a person kind of behind on their developmental trajectory. And basically you can kind of imagine just like an individual who either gets pregnant or has a child at 14 years old, 15 years old, and then all of a sudden, okay, I'm ahead of schedule in that case, and then kind of the spillover effects of life, maybe less time to attend school, have social experience just life, social interactions with peers, etc., and that kind of creates a spillover effect, and then you kind of get a trajectory of everything being kind of off timing, which then can contribute to certain long-term developmental outcomes, or negative long-term developmental outcomes. Now looking to some specific differences in kind of timing variations across adulthood. First class, individuals in poverty experience more noise, pollution, crowding, family disruption, hunger, exposure to violence. This creates an accumulation of stress, lower academic achievement, poorer mental health and well-being. Individuals from lower income families tend to reach milestones of adulthood earlier. They're asked to grow up fast. So kind of my previous example with a teenage couple having a child, and all those, and being off timing kind of fairly consistently, just in general. First of all, the individuals who are more likely to kind of have a teenage pregnancy are already kind of low in resources, social, economic, financial, and even well, I should say at the individual and kind of community level. So kind of poor individuals kind of tending to live in poor neighborhoods, but kind of that accumulation of stress through that developmental pathway, kind of setting someone on a trajectory, kind of building all those things being correlated, lower noise, hunger, family disruption, pollution, exposure to violence, all those things being, fairly correlated, accumulating together in this kind of off-track, off-timing developmental sequence, contributing to and being correlated with things like lower academic achievement. And interestingly, though, developmental trajectories are also, there's variation within subcultures. So there's not just like the one culture, obviously, of when expectations occur. So poor individuals kind of growing up in lower income neighborhoods or states, whatever, or have different expectations. They may be they're less expected maybe to go to college or earn kind of a prestigious kind of career. Instead, they're kind of asked to grow up fast just based on the circumstances of the life around them. So they'll have kind of a different developmental track, but those subcultures kind of still exist within this larger, like in this case, like U.S. system, wherein advantages are to, or financial and kind of social advantages are not or less likely to be kind of allocated to those accelerated or off-timing developmental trajectories. So it may be, slightly necessary for an individual that, take a job at 17, 16, or 18 years old and forgo college and work multiple hours to support the collective low-income family, but that and thus they're being asked to grow up faster. But over time, just due to numerous factors within a culture, can contribute to accumulation of stress, which is correlated with various long-term negative outcomes across adulthood. Now, interestingly, what even is adulthood? That definition has changed throughout history. So children, for example, come to be viewed as different from adults in the 17th century. Emerging adulthood, defined in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Old age, defined old age as a period of retirement in the 20th century. So the idea of children originally were just kind of like, oh, these are just young adults. But then that changed in the 1600s, and then you can even see in the 20th century with getting rid of child labor laws working in the United States. But there's still violations of child labor throughout the world, kind of reflecting different historical change of the expectation, the social trajectory of a child across history, and kind of seeing that reflection, that cultural expectation of childhood being reflected in labor laws and educational laws with mandatory primary education, for example. Emerging adulthood, a very recent concept, frankly, late 20th century, early 21st century. There's not a clear-cut definition. There's kind of a clear-cut definition of emerging adulthood, but there's a range of when does emerging adulthood begin and when does it end. And in old age, define old age as a period of retirement 20th century. That's kind of straightforward. Social Security did not exist for the until whatever it was, like mid 1930s. So kind of like that idea of old age and retirement being important is, again, kind of definitely a recent phenomenon in humanity, but in the United States as well. And thus kind of the developmental expectation, the social roles associated with that part of adulthood is going to change because it reflects this kind of new definition, these new social programs, this new expectation of older adults in past mid-1930s. Skipping ahead to gender roles. Gender roles are defined as a pattern of behavior that adults and males should adopt in a particular society. Gender schema theory. Theory stating children are taught to view world and themselves through gender polarized lenses. Social role theory, explanation of gender roles based on children viewing the gender divisions around them and modeling their behavior on those divisions. Proximal causes, factors present in the immediate environment. Distal causes, factors that were present in the distant past. Evolutionary psychology explains human behavior in terms of genetic patterns. All right, so we have gender roles, as kind of stated, patterns of behavior, of males and female behavior in a particular society, which is obviously going to be reflective of culture and historical era. And then we have kind of two different theories here that we'll cover about gender development throughout the lifespan. One, gender schema, where children are taught to view the world themselves through gender polarized lenses, and kind of through time, as children go through development and reach adulthood, that kind of accumulation of expectations and belief about how different genders should act based on kind of the world around them, they will kind of internalize those beliefs and then act accordingly throughout their lifespan. Social role theory, just kind of viewing the world around them and then kind of being, and kind of just modeling that behavior, really. So this is kind of just looking at your parents or kind of school classmates or teachers or something along those lines, and then just like kind of copying that. You're literally modeling it. You're seeing the social roles around you, and then you're trying to emulate it in your own life. Proximal causes changes in your immediate environment. So maybe something like a nursery being painted blue as a boy, and then a boy being told, "Oh, you're going to play sports," and the sister being told that, "Oh, you have to, I don't know, to be a stay-at-home mom," or something along those lines. So kind of like those direct, kind of immediate gender role definitions. Distal causes, so factors that are present in the distant past. So maybe something that happens in the past that kind of leaves a historical legacy. So I don't know, maybe differences in funding of women in men's sports throughout, in schools growing up, and then adulthood and professional leagues. So and those kind of funding mechanisms, those kind of norms set up, decades beforehand. So kind of these distal things that happen in the distant past. And then we have evolutionary psychologists who kind of look at the behaviors of contemporary behaviors and then kind of try to draw reasons for those supposed differences between genders, behaviors, and outcomes, and try and tie it to kind of like this evolutionary theory, something like, oh, men do X because, you know, during caveman days they had to, I don't know, gather and kill animals or something along those lines. Then there's obviously a lot of problems with this, and that's one, you know, it's very difficult to actually confirm these things or test these things. You know, these are speculations that occurred hundreds of thousands of years ago or tens of thousands of years ago. So it's very difficult to verify, and also you're kind of just looking around the world around you and then kind of ascribing an innate gender difference to kind of the contemporary moment. So it's kind of a similar limitation to kind of cross-sectional research design, where an individuals kind of look at those cross-sectional research design when comparing ages, I should say, age differences in performance on whatever task. You're kind of looking at those two groups and then possibly coming to the conclusion that there's this innate difference when really there might be these other underlying causes that aren't being measured in your study. So you're kind of ascribing this innate universal difference wherein it might be reflective of something else. And jumping ahead a little bit in the interest of time, the social role theory of gender, just to kind of highlight this a little bit more. Average levels of behavior may be noticeably different for males and females. Within each sex, there's variability. Why do unfounded stereotypes persist? Social role theory, differences in the roles that women and men play in society create and maintain gender stereotypes. Define the roles played in society as innate. So kind of the idea here is that as stated, you look around you and say, oh, look at it, there are kind of differences within XYZ outcome across gender. Therefore, these differences are innate. So kind of the social role theory of kind of gender stereotypes being that kind of the differences, the roles, the expectations of society about genders kind of contributing to these gender stereotypes. So kind of there's these social expectations, social roles in the past, literally like economic and political roles, where women not even being able to attend certain universities or attend certain jobs, and then kind of that those barriers, those structural barriers, creating differences, and those differences then being interpreted as innate differences and thus contributing to stereotypes. And as stated in, I'll probably say it in every chapter, there's a variation within every group, and in this case genders, with a wide degree of variability within each males and females in their developmental outcomes and career paths and life trajectories. Continuing on with gender stereotypes, they can be defined as overgeneralized and largely inaccurate beliefs about the characteristics of all males and females. They're generated by society's gender norms. Studies have found that men and women describe themselves more similarly in the 90s than men and women in the 70s. Instrumental qualities, personal characteristics that have an active impact, stereotypical male qualities. Communal qualities, personal characteristics that nurture and bring people together, stereotypically female qualities. So kind of here we kind of like two kind of classic, quote unquote gender differences, with more of this instrumental kind of active role in the world being prescribed to stereotypically male behavior versus more of a nurturer, bringing people together, stereotypically female quality. But interestingly, and you can again reflecting historical eras and like changes in structures and how kind of those stereotypes evolve and shift over time, how the way studies demonstrate that the way that men and women describe themselves as compared to whatever it was 60, 70 years ago, those differences have declined, and differences in self-description have actually narrowed throughout the 19th and 20th century, or I should say 20th and 21st centuries. So again, kind of reflecting this idea that gender stereotypes are reflective of these kind of larger structures, and kind of just like looking around your world and then saying, oh, I guess these are natural, describing differences that you see kind of as these natural processes. But kind of here, kind of demonstrating that the way that individuals describe themselves on kind of a gender level has changed. And specifically instrumental and communal qualities have changed, during the last 50 or so years. Moving on to gender roles across cultures. Cultural variation in gender roles can arise from the different environments within which people live. In those cultures where the environment is harsh and requires courage and physical prowess to secure a living, such as places where large game is hunted or risky deep-sea fishing is performed, cultures of masculinity that value the strength and toughness of males are more likely to emerge. South Pacific island of Truk, men traditionally had to go on dangerous deep-sea fishing expeditions to obtain food for their families. Trukis greatly value masculinity, demonstrated by young men engaging in frequent violent drunken fights with knives and clubs. In cultures where the environment is more benign and food is plentiful, androgynous gender roles are more likely to emerge. Men in Tahiti do not hunt. The shallow lagoons provide ample fishing without the need to venture into treacherous waters, and the rich volcanic soils allow for the easy harvesting of taro, cassava, coconuts, and fruit. There is virtually no warfare or feuding in Tahiti, and there is little evidence that masculinity is a matter of much concern for Tahitians. In general, a survey of the norms for masculinity across diverse ecological contexts led one anthropologist to conclude that, quote, the harsher the environment and the scarcer the resources, the more manhood stresses the inspiration and the goal. So kind of the idea here just that the environment in which an individual grows up in, the harshness, the terrain, the access to resources, influences gender roles within a society. So kind of again reflecting historical eras, reflecting your environment, and those environmental differences contributing to kind of the likelihood of individual gender roles developing and shaping really the collective roles. So it's kind of like this environment kind of shaping these collective roles, which then kind of filter down into an individual. So kind of, again, it's not just these individual identities forming, but rather reflective of these larger environments. Okay, moving on to social roles, kind of social development and sexual orientation. Alfred Kinsey was among the first to conceptualize sexuality as a continuum rather than a strict dichotomy of gay and straight, created a 7-point rating scale that ranged from exclusively heterosexual to exclusively homosexual. Research supports the idea of a continuum. Homosexual behavior has been documented in over 450 species. Approximately 3% of males and 1.5% of females identify as gay, lesbian, or bisexual. APA 1973 saw same-sex attraction as a normal variation of human sexuality and does not support use of therapy to change orientations. Perinatal environment could be linked to gender nonconformity and sexual orientation. It's likely a complex interaction of genetic, biological, social, and cultural factors. So kind of just the idea, big takeaways here. APA prior to 1973, why I pointed that out, is because the idea of same-sex attraction was seen as abnormal, reflecting an abnormal psychology prior to that time, according to the APA. So kind of, again, reflecting these changes of norms, expectations, in social development, or kind of society social development, on that kind of level. Reflecting and contributing to viewpoints on sexual orientation. And you can imagine someone who's homosexual in the 1920s or something along those lines, who are forced to form a heterosexual relationship, and then that could, or maybe decline to participate in a heterosexual relationship, and then maybe contribute to being looked upon strangely in the 1920s, and then thus contributing, being off timing of a heterosexual relationship, kind of contributing to kind of like stress and poor developmental outcomes. Now, kind of moving on to kind of social developmental tracks of transgender identity. There's 5 here: pre-coming out, coming out, exploration, intimacy, and identity integration. There is no one single path among the stages of transgender identity. It depends on social and economic resources and characteristics of the person. And looking at specific stages: exploration, learning as much as possible, testing boundaries of what this identity means, research and consider how to best live, name, clothing, surgery, hormones. Intimacy, transgender men seem to have an easier time than transgendered women. Positive intimate relationships are influenced by one's sexual orientation. Like non-transgender youth, heterosexuals have a smoother path than homosexual orientation trans youth. Identity and integration, union of one's public and private life. Research indicates that their gender perceptions of self are much more like those of transgender gender or of their express roles. So kind of the idea here, kind of as stated in the previous slide, is that there's really no specific time line for this development of trans social roles, trans social trajectories, developmental trajectories. So this can begin, in adolescence, or before that, or it can begin in adulthood. It really depends on the individuals, and not just the individual, but dependent on the social and economic resources and characteristics of a person. So if it's somebody who may be more wealthy, has the financial resources to kind of support themselves, to pay for gender reaffirming surgery, or even social resources, having family members, a community that maybe supports them more, have been studies suggest that there are more positive developmental outcomes. And just kind of the scarcity or the plentifulness of those social, economic resources kind of contributing to the progression of these stages and when these stages begin. So kind of now taking a step back more towards kind of a generalized view of social roles in young adulthood. Transition to adulthood, a period during which young people take on social roles of early adulthood. Emerging adulthood, debate of transition from adolescence to young adulthood, approximately ages 18 to 25 or 29. During the 19th century, novels about the struggle of adolescence first appeared in abundance, perhaps due to the greater array of choices adolescents had. The number of options had continued to grow, and now people often take longer before assuming adult roles. And then we have 5 features of emerging adulthood that we'll walk through. But kind of before moving on, as I stated before, kind of a debate of what the time frame of emerging adulthood is, and frankly that's kind of reflective of political and economic circumstances, wherein individuals are staying in college longer. There's higher rates of student debt, kind of less jobs that pay a living wage, and thus kind of delaying, quote unquote, delaying adulthood. But interestingly, you even see this, hundreds of years ago in the 19th century, wherein kind of the age of industrialization, people leaving kind of their local communities, leaving like kind of like local plots of farming land and going into more urban communities, and taking on different jobs. So kind of a reflection of kind of an economic shift where more jobs are emerging, more migration is emerging, being reflective in these kind of novels about the struggles of emerging adults having to make more choices, because there's literally more choices now that exist due to kind of this larger structural economic shift. So now kind of going over these kind of 5 classic features of emerging adulthood. Age of identity exploration. Erickson proposed that it was during adolescence that humans wrestled with the question of identity. Trend during the 20th century of a, quote, prolonged adolescence in industrialized society, kind of before the idea of emerging adulthood emerged. Some people called it prolonged adolescence, now typically referred to as emerging adulthood. Age of instability. Emerging adults change jobs, relationships, and residences more frequently than other age groups. Age of self-focus. Begin to see their parents as people, not just parents, something most adolescents fail to do. There are fewer obligations to others, the time where they can do what they want with their life. Again, this is obviously variations across culture and across historical eras, but kind of this is the globalized kind of general view here that's just obviously debated, but this is kind of the classic trajectory here, the classic features of emerging adulthood. Next, the age of feeling in between. Gone through the changes of puberty, are typically no longer in high school, and many have also moved out of their parents' home. May still be financially dependent on their parents to some degree, typically have not finished their education, obtained a good full-time job in a committed relationship. Age of possibilities, more optimism as more 18 to 25-year-olds feel that they will someday get to where they want to be in life, the chance to transform their lives and more away from unhealthy environments. So in between, kind of being caught in between. So you graduated high school, maybe you work a job, but you also live at home, or you don't work a job and you're still going to college, for example. So kind of straightforward here. You're in between, kind of you're in this transition period in between having these more adolescent roles and more of these adult roles. That's kind of emerging adulthood. And then the age of possibilities. This, I think, is definitely reflective of historical eras where we'll talk about it. You won't be testing on this. We'll talk about it in probably a future discussion. But different views of the age of possibility, of what the optimism are for the future, with frankly kind of lower rates of optimism for the future among newer cohorts or younger cohorts of 18 to 25-year-olds. Than even older adults, but kind of in general, the classic view is that you're young, anything is possible, I can move anywhere I want, I can transform my life, I can leave my hashtag toxic home or whatever, and anything is possible. It's kind of the idea here. And kind of those features of adulthood are kind of reflect 5 features or 5 milestones, let's just say, across development. Completing school, leaving home, becoming financially independent, getting married, having at least one child. The United States in 1960, 77% of women and 65% of men had passed all 5 milestones by the age of 30. 2000, fewer than half women and less than 1/3 of men have done so by age of 30. So kind of again reflecting these 5 milestones, which were typically associated with being that social clock, that being on time, and thus my self-evaluation that I'm meeting the expectation of society, have shifted with fairly radically. With as stated here, 77% of women, 65% of men meeting all 5 of those milestones by the age of 30 in 1960 versus 40 years later, and I can say even 60 years later now, fewer than half and fewer than 1/3 of men by age of 30 meeting those milestones. And things like getting married, becoming financially independent, being pushed back even later. It's even the latest it's ever been, actually, in recent years. So it kind of, again, reflecting historical variation and even class variation. So becoming financially independent, and not just kind of the straightforward, just having to work instead of going to college, but having to maybe take on more student loan debt, and thus you have more debt, and maybe you have to live with your parents for longer. Thus you can't leave home, and you may be less likely to get married or become financially independent, etc. Turning to cultural variations in the milestones, emerging adults in Japan and South Korea, like Western Europeans, tend to enter marriage and parenthood around age 30. They have social welfare systems that aid that transition. They pursue identity development during emerging adulthood, like their American and European counterparts, but within narrower boundaries set by their sense of obligation to others. Emerging adults in the United States and Europe consistently rank financial independence among the most important markers of adulthood. Emerging adults with an Asian cultural background especially emphasize becoming capable of supporting parents financially as among the most important criteria. So we have some cultural differences here with Japan and South Korea having more social welfare systems support emerging adulthood, thus kind of acting as a protective factor during emerging adulthood to kind of get people more on their feet, which is not a feature of the United States, for example. So that's kind of those differences of kind of public policy contributing to individuals being able to successfully meet some of those milestones. But interestingly, in comparing Japan, South Korea, and other kind of East Asian cultures to American and European counterparts, kind of that identity development stage kind of does continue on and through emerging adulthood, but and actually have similar kind of markers of importance in that case of finances. But in the case of the U.S. and kind of Western Europe, finances kind of being ranked important, primarily, or the number one reason, on average, being financial independence, kind of a more individualistic, I gotta do me kind of situation, versus more of Asian cultural background. Finances being important, but individuals on average kind of more citing that not just as important to themselves, but also as important to kind of providing for their families, and kind of reflecting that collectivist cultural norm within those societies. Boomerang Kids, young adults who are returning after having lived independently outside the home. Many of the same financial reasons that are influencing young people's decisions to delay exit from the home of their parents are underlying their decisions to return home. Financial reasons, emotional distress such as mental health issues contribute. First time in modern times, living with parents has become the most common living arrangement from 18 to 34-year-olds in the U.S. In 1960, only about 20% of Americans aged 18 to 34 lived with parents, whereas 62% lived with a spouse or partner. Now, 32% live with parents, and 32% live with a spouse or partner. Over 40% of Canadians and Europeans in this age range live with their parents, so the United States may only be catching up to the rest of the Western world. Children who return are more likely to have had good relationships with their parents growing up, so there may be less stress between parents and their adult children who return. Parents of young adults who have moved back home because of economic reasons report that they are just as satisfied with their life as are parents whose adult children are still living independently. So we have these boomerang children kind of challenging the idea of those 5 traditional milestones of development, and especially, and you can see how even the U.S. focuses here compared to Canadian and Europeans. Wherein the differences in individual 18 to 34-year-olds, so kind of early adulthood and emerging adulthood is kind of a little broader than the 18 to 27, but it's still kind of within a similar age range, and kind of reflecting people staying in college longer and attending college at older ages. In 1960, only about 20% of that age range lived with their parents, compared to now with about 32% living with their parents, which, as stated, kind of reflects these structural reasons, such as economic reasons, such as Great Recession, COVID, kind of contributing to recession. So kind of these economic factors that through time, and even since 1960, really since the 1980s, these the idea of kind of you get a career living wage job at a very young age kind of went out the window for a lot of reasons. And then kind of the emergence of 2 parent working households, kind of that, and kind of a decline of, or sorry, I should say a stagnation of wages, really for the better part of 50 years, kind of all contributing to shifts in the developmental expectations of meeting those 5 milestones, and thus kind of a re-evaluation of kind of the social expectations, and really the feelings of behind. And really it's going to be interesting of how individuals and collectives evaluate these shifts, these quote unquote delays in developmental transitions that is living alone. A changing system and a changing world. There are more single adults, never married, 28%. It kind of ranges. I've seen as high as like 36%. More postponed marriages. 1960, age 20 for women was the average age of marriage, 23 for men. In 2011, age 27 for women, 29 for men. More unmarried parents. 41% of births in 2010 were to unmarried women. There are fewer children and more multi-generational families. There are more children living in poverty, and there are more years without children, and there are fewer caregivers of aging adults. So you can see all these massive shifts that are occurring at this historical, this chrono shift, reflecting these macro level shifts, wherein marriage age is now delayed, the percentage of unmarried parents increasing, and that's not. That's more of a reflection of kind of individuals not getting married or delaying marriage, but still having kids. So kind of being in a partnership, cohabitating together, and having children, but not being married. And also more multi-generational families, which is reflective of a longer lifespan. And thus individuals living longer, and then possibly combined with wage stagnation and kind of a decline in pension funds, and kind of reflecting decline of union kind of large scale retirement plans because of the decline of unions in the U.S. More multi-generational families within the same household because an older adult is incapable, or many older adults live in poverty and are incapable of self-supporting themselves. So we have all these big shifts changing the expectations of developmental outcomes and developmental trajectories in individuals in the U.S. Now, I mentioned cohabitation, but let's go ahead and define cohabitation. It can be defined as living together in an intimate partnership without marriage. Reason for cohabitation: convenience. In a romantic relationship and want an affordable living arrangement, trial marriage, or an alternative to marriage with no intention to marry. So kind of straightforward here. Convenience, it's rents are very high. So living together but not being married yet, or not wanting to give, either not being ready for marriage or an alternative to marriage, or no intention to marry, but still, hey, I'm in this committed relationship. I'm not going to live separately because that's rents are too damn high. So therefore, what's combined are expensive and split some of these crazy costs. But also, many partners live in the same house, but with an intention to marry with time. So kind of just a trial marriage. And this again reflects a shift, a historical era, wherein these rates of cohabitation increasing across the decades in the U.S. Expanding on historical trends in becoming a parent, 85% of adults in the U.S. will become parents. It's a major role transition. Childbirth rate is at a historical low. At the average age women give birth is 26, which has increased almost 4 years over the last 3 decades. And 40% of all births are to unmarried parents. And at the top, you can see the average age of parenthood across various cultures. Now let's get into specifics about the child-rearing family. New parenthood is a stressful transition. Marital satisfaction typically slightly declines in the first year after a baby is born and continues to decline. There are spillover effects from work stress on family life or vice versa. Claims energy from marital relationship can disproportionately harm a mother's sense of mastery/self-esteem. Fathers often become more involved in childcare when a second child is born. Most mothers work outside the home. Half or more of both dads and mothers are in dual career families. They say they find it difficult to balance work and family. Parents emphasize the positives about a parenthood and feel it has contributed to a great deal to their personal development. So kind of idea here is we have obviously a huge new addition to the family, and this is going to be a big transition. It's going to be stressful, but as we talked about before in previous previous chapters, differences between kind of this quote-unquote toxic or kind of chronic stress, or more of this positive temporary stress. In this case here, we do see kind of a dip in marital satisfaction, but interestingly, parents emphasize the positives about parenthood and feel it has contributed a great deal to their personal development. So kind of reflecting this idea of, some stress is good because it's challenging, it increases developmental outcomes, in this case, kind of personal development, being more patient, maybe more empathetic, etc. But it should be noted that kind of families with more resources, financial, social support, having higher likelihood of kind of that stress of being a new parent, being kind of a positive stressor. Or I should say, individuals with lower resources having a higher likelihood of that transition being a kind of a chronic stressor, or a more challenging stressor at least, due to social support, financial support, etc. And as stated, most mothers work outside of the home. This again reflecting dual income households, and also kind of these macro. There's not really there's not a national parental leave program in the United States compared to other Western European countries or countries across Asia. So kind of that structural difference contributing to parenting expectations and differences in the roles that take place among new parents. Researchers have repeatedly found that mothers and fathers are similar in caring for infants. They're able to feed their babies effectively, provide sensitive parenting, become objects of attachment, serve as secure bases. Mothers spend more time directly caring for infants. Few differences between mothers and fathers in how they interact with their children. Fathers tend to play more, mothers provide more direct care. So kind of this idea, like a classic idea, this is a classic emphasis in psychology of really focusing on mothers and really an individual. It's a combination of like emphasis on mothers and kind of this individual orientation, focusing on solely mothers as impactful of their child's development and kind of caregiving responsibilities, but kind of again shifts in women being allowed to enter in the workplace and kind of shifts in just wage stagnation and the requirements of like I have to provide for this child. Mothers and fathers both working outside the household. Those are going to shift kind of caregiving responsibilities, and researchers, as stated, find that fathers are able to provide sensitive parenting, become important objects of attachments. But mothers, on average, do spend more time directly caring for their infants, and kind of in general, fathers spending more time working hours to kind of pay for these new bills or whatever, which can obviously impact women's career trajectory, because kind of these gap in the resumes or whatever along those lines. But again, this kind of can reflect what resources you're bringing to the table prior to parenthood, financial and social resources, and kind of personal psychological resources to the table. And those all kind of reflect how, or impact how you interact with the child and how parents interact with each other. Which leads us to kind of this idea of mother, fathers, and infants kind of being as its own kind of system. Mother-child and father-child relationships cannot be understood without considering the spouse. Indirect effects. Mothers who have close, supportive relationship with husbands tend to interact more patiently and sensitive with their babies. Fathers who have just had a pleasant conversation with their wives are more supportive and engaged with when they interact with their children. When parents compete rather than cooperate, their infants may show signs of insecure attachment or may become securely attached to one parent, but be blocked from enjoying closer relationship with both parents. So kind of the idea here is that there are these, this is a dynamic kind of system of development going on here. We have the father-child relationship, the mother-child relationship, the father-child relationship, all these things, all these relationships interacting dynamically and contributing to direct and indirect effects, which are correlated with certain developmental outcomes of both the parents and the child. So as stated, mothers who have close supportive relationships with their husbands tend to be more patient and sensitive with their children, and kind of the same finding for fathers as well. And that, which obviously can contribute to developmental outcomes in their child due to differences in attachment styles and parenting practices. I've alluded to this several times, but let's go into more detail about dual career families. Working parents experience spillover effects, ways in which events at work affect home life and events at home carry over into the workplace. Parents' stressful day at work, withdrawn from spouse and children after work. No indication that mothers working has damaging effects on development. U.S. has no national policy of paid family leave. So kind of as I said before, that the family unit being these interactive dynamic systems, obviously, that's not the only relationships going on in the world. Working parents still work, and they have different kind of dynamic relationships in their workplace. And those relationships can spill over. So parents' stressful day at work, you come home and you're withdrawn from your spouse and your children after work, and then that can contribute to rocky relationship with your spouse and in your child, and kind of poor developmental outcomes. And that can then compound and accumulate and kind of contribute to kind of a downward spiral. Another important thing to note is that there's no indication that mothers working has damaging effect on child development. As I alluded, U.S. has no national policy of paid family leave, which is going to impact kind of these indirect relationships among the spouse and the child. And these the great spillover effects, because obviously if you had paid family leave, you would be working less or not working at all in a workplace, and thus the potential kind of for those spillover effects would be non-existent. But that is not the case in the U.S. And just here are some historical trends in parenting roles. You can see the rise of dual incomes being a majority of households. And you can see shifts in the level of caregiving responsibilities, wherein mothers and fathers kind of converging a little bit, but still mothers spending more time staying home to take care of their home and family. And then the kind of the far right chart with the average number of hours per week. And again, these hours converging, but still gender differences in 2016, with about 6 more hours per week of direct childcare for mothers than fathers. But again, the trend being that they are converging through time, and at the same time, both parents working, taking on more responsibility through time. Again, reflecting all these economic and political shifts in the last 50, 60 years. Gender ideology, attitudes and beliefs about the roles of and equality of men and women. Couples that hold more egalitarian views early on are more equally divided household tasks in later years. Boys who grow up with working mothers are more likely to have egalitarian views. So kind of the idea here is just, again, as I stated throughout this class, you just don't magically shift your ideology, in this case your gender ideology, at a certain age. Obviously changes occur, but it's just not like you hit this a certain age and then it just magically appear. In this case here, this is a specific example, boys who grew up with working mothers are more likely to have egalitarian views about beliefs, attitudes, and the role and overall equality of men and women in society. And couples who have more egalitarian views early on are more likely to equally divide household tasks throughout their the adult lifespan. Going into a little more detail about childless married couples, childlessness does not diminish the well-being of adults. It sometimes boosts it. Marital satisfaction higher than couples with children during child-rearing years. Child-free women are more likely to work throughout their adult lives, have somewhat higher level jobs, and earn more money. Childless adults have strong social network of siblings, cousins, nieces, and nephews. Fewer role transitions for child-free men and women. And children do not guarantee happiness. Not having children does not mean unhappiness. So kind of the idea here is that childless adults can still develop strong social networks, and ultimately having children or not having children does not guarantee happiness either way. And there's obviously variation of developmental trajectories for both child couples and childless couples. However, there are differences because in kind of the social roles that are expected throughout the life, because obviously you have to kind of deal with a child throughout their entire lifespan, which will require different roles, maybe becoming a grandparent, etc. And going more in depth on gay and lesbian families, gay and lesbian relationships evolve through the same stages of development as heterosexual couples. Relationships are usually egalitarian. Parents share responsibilities equally and tend to work out a division of labor based on who is talented at or does not mind doing certain tasks. Lesbian mothers are similar to heterosexual mothers. Children have similar developmental needs. Children are no more likely to develop homosexual or bisexual orientation. Legal barriers can make parenting challenging. A study found that the well-being of children was associated with the social climate of the area in which the family lived was supportive of sexual minorities. So as stated, parents of gay and lesbian families, dividing household labor or labor in general based on the talent of an individual and what it is that they enjoy doing. And importantly, studies have found that the well-being of children was associated with kind of social climate and the support of sexual minorities within a country or a community or state. So, the more disenfranchised or living in more areas with more disenfranchised laws targeting gay and lesbian families or trans children, contributing to a decrease of well-being in the children of those households. Social roles in middle adulthood. The middle years bring stable levels of physical health and increases in reported quality of life. The parenting role becomes less demanding as children age. Most men and women become grandparents. Marriages and partners become happier. Relationships with parents change. And most adults have settled into careers. So these are kind of self-evidence with relationship with parents changing as the child grows up, has either their own children, maybe their own spouses, or at least capable of having a full-time job, etc. So shifts in parenting roles, demands of parenting, and kind of more stability in general, historically, I should say, and during middle adulthood. And one specific feature of middle adulthood is the empty nest phenomenon. Parents react more positively than negatively to children leaving home, fewer roles and responsibilities, less strain and stress, more opportunity to focus on their marital relationship, and evidence they have done their jobs as a parent. So kind of interesting, this empty nest phenomenon, in historical psychology records, which is now completely shift on the idea, was that women in particular would be feeling depressed and losing self-esteem because they've lost their role as mothers, which is obviously this innate, specific part of being a woman, and therefore they've lost a piece of themselves with the empty nest, and then they have to struggle to do this transition. Well, research now demonstrates that is not the case, and parents react more positively than negatively to children leaving their home, and as stated, roles and responsibilities are reduced, and there's more opportunities to work on your marital relationships, and again, evidence that they did a good job as a parent. Jumping ahead to becoming a grandparent, there are 65 million grandparents in the US. There are more grandparents today than at any time in history. The majority of grandparents are under age 65, but that will change as baby boomers age, and most grandparents live within 10 miles of at least one grandchild. So, reflecting historical era, shifts in technology, health, contributing to increased lifespans. Thus, there will be more grandparents in general than past centuries. And thus, why it was important before, but even more so now, why it's important to understand developmental roles and developmental trajectories in grandparenthood. There are three major styles of grandparenting: remote, which is geographically and emotional distance; compassionate or companionate, which is the most common style. They see grandchildren frequently, enjoy activities with them, involved, often help with childcare, give advice, and play other practical roles in their grandchildren's lives. Grandparents contribute greatly to grandchildren's development and can mentor young single parents. A close grandparent-grandchild relationship can protect children of a depressed parent from becoming depressed. Children raised by a single mother and a grandparent resemble children raised by two adults. Very well said by me. So kind of the idea here is that we have these three different types, ranging from emotionally distant, being geographically far away from their grandchildren and their children, to being very involved, so helping with childcare, giving advice, and playing very daily roles or frequent roles in the grandchildren's lives. And interestingly, researchers have found that grandparents can serve a buffer role, that is, reduce the impact of stress on a child. So if a parent is depressed or distracted or for a variety of reasons, a grandparent can actually kind of reduce the negative impacts of that kind of depressed parent on a child's developmental outcomes. And also, children who are raised by a single mother and grandparents in general resemble the developmental outcomes of children raised by two parents. So kind of, again, grandparents can kind of buffer the impacts of parental dysfunction or non-optimal kind of parenting practices, which can reflect in a variety of that can emerge from a variety of sources, some combination of cumulative stress in a parent. There are challenges, however, for grandparents assuming the role of a parent. They lack sufficient funds. About 20% of grandparents live below the poverty line. Without legal custody, they can't collect child support, give medical care for their child, or interact with the children's school. problems of parental origin, of reason parents are unable to care for their children, drug addiction, criminal behavior, domestic violence. Major source of stress for grandparents comes from lack of support from their own children. So we kind of have a couple of issues here: lack of sufficient funds. So again, Social Security really not being that much money, a decline of kind of pensions contributing to an increase, or just 20%. One out of five grandparents living below poverty, let alone not being in poverty, but having not a lot of extra disposable income. Also, without legal custody, so kind of there's not as much legal recognition of grandparents' role of their grandchild, and thus they are less. They cannot receive child support, for example, or get medical care, or interact with children's school because the school is permitted, for example, to only interact with their parents unless otherwise authorized by their parents. And I've actually had this because I was raised by my grandparents. All these legal loopholes that you have to jump through. Can be a pain in the ass and kind of accumulates the stress and negative developmental outcomes, not just for the child, but for the grandparent as well. And some problems of what's just kind of dealing with their child, which their child may not be parenting their children as much because of maybe drug addiction, criminal behavior, domestic violence, poverty, etc., and all of those factors being correlated. But there can also be stressors for parents. And specifically the middle generation squeeze. The situation of a middle-aged adult pressured by demands from both the younger and older generations simultaneously. 33% of women aged 55 to 69 report caring for both older and younger generations. Daughters provide more emotional support, sons about as involved in providing help with practical tasks and financial assistance. Caregiver burden, psychological distress with the demands of providing care for someone with physical or cognitive impairments. Do not want to help or help out of duty, lack personal resources, lack social and cultural support from caregiving. Cultural norms affect stress associated with caregiving for older adults. So kind of the idea here is that because again reflecting this developmental trend wherein individuals are living longer, there are now this middle generational squeeze, these rates of middle generational squeeze increasing, wherein you have to kind of balance demands between your child and your parent, who may be less able to manage everyday living situations, but also having to take care of your child, who depending on their age, has their own issues going on, which can contribute together depending on the circumstances of the middle-aged adult's life to negative developmental outcomes across the board, across all the younger, older, in that middle generation. However, this is not a kind of universal phenomenon, caregiver burden. Caregiver burden is more likely when the middle generation lacks resources, didn't want to help at all anyway. They lack social resources, they lack cultural support, and the norm associated with this middle generational squeeze, taking care of younger and older generations, the norms associated within a particular culture affect the amount of stress associated with caregiving for older adults. So if there's more of an expectation in culture, the middle generational squeeze is less likely to happen because it's kind of just a typical it's normative within that culture. And overall, 10% of adults between the ages of 25 and 64 provide unpaid care for another person. The care receiver is usually a mother, and the majority of caregivers are women. The middle-aged caregiver role is to arrange for services and assist for independent daily activities. 40% of middle-aged caregivers work full-time. So not only are these caregivers, taking care of their parents, but at the same time, almost 50% of them, a little under 50%, under a majority, working a full-time job. And presumably, if they are married, their spouse is also working a full-time job. So kind of just another more time allocated being when caregiving for an older adult. And again, reflecting kind of these larger public programs, there's the level of financial assistance of Social Security will reflect this, and the kind of the lack of a universal caregiving care, which is found in some Western European and East Asian countries, impacting the amount of labor, the amount of unpaid labor required by these in general majority of women. Social roles and late adulthood transitions into simplified forms of formal roles, once considered a time of role loss. However, there is no typical way in which adults react to role changes in a late adulthood. So kind of straightforward here. So similar roles, but maybe a simpler version. And as I stated in the kind of first or second slide, it used to be conceptualized as just losing roles, but now it's more conceptualized as transforming roles or taking on different roles in older adulthood. And there is no typical way, no just universal way, I should say, in which adults react to role changes in late adulthood. Now, one interesting phenomenon I want to talk about is living arrangements. In 2017, in those 65 years of age and older, approximately 72% of men and 48% of women live with their spouse or partner. Between 1900 and 1990, the number of older adults living alone increased, most likely due to improvements in health and longevity during this time. Women make up the majority of older adults living alone in the US. The number has dropped from those living alone in 1990. Older women are more likely to be unmarried, living with children, with other relatives or non-relatives. Older adults who live alone report feeling more financially strapped than those living with others. According to a Pew Research Center study, only 33% of those living alone reported they were living comfortably, while nearly about 50% of those living with others said they were living comfortably. 12% of those living alone, but only 5% of those living with others reported they lacked money for basic needs. So kind of the idea here is we see shifts and rates of living alone, and we see gender differences. And this could reflect the fact that men die earlier. So if your spouse dies earlier, or your male spouse dies earlier, that will contribute to women living without a partner at a higher rate because their partner is dead, versus males, with their, in general, on average, women living longer, and thus, when they are alive, more likely to live with their spouse or partner. However, or I should say, kind of reflecting that, older women are more likely to live with children and other relatives, and they make up the majority of older adults living alone. And this leads us to loneliness. Loneliness can be described as the discrepancy between the social contact a person has and the contacts a person wants. It can result from social or emotional isolation. Women tend to experience loneliness due to social isolation. Men from emotional isolation. Loneliness can be accompanied by a lack of self-worth, impatience, desperation, and depression. Being alone does not always result in loneliness. For some, it means solitude. Solitude involves gaining self-awareness, taking care of the self, being comfortable alone, and pursuing one's interests. In contrast, loneliness is perceived social isolation. Loneliness in social isolation was linked to a 40% increase in risk for dementia and 30% increase in the risk of stroke or coronary heart disease. This was hypothesized to be due to a rise in stress hormones, depression, anxiety, as well as the individual lacking encouragement from others to engage in healthy behaviors. So kind of our big takeaway here is that living alone does not necessarily mean loneliness, but if you are experiencing loneliness, has been found to be linked to increases in dementia, risk for stroke, coronary heart disease. So kind of, you're socially isolated. You want to communicate with someone, but you're unable to do so, which is distressing, which is stressful, which can harm your body from kind of chronic stress from being alone. And not only that, and this is a classic kind of spiraling, and an example of multiple correlations across these factors, or the more intercorrelated nature of these environmental factors. If an individual is lonely and alone, they are less likely to go out, socialize, exercise, perform cognitively enhancing activities, and all that accumulation contributing to higher increase of developing dementia or having a stroke. Relatedly, this kind of dovetails into the widowhood mortality effect. This refers to the higher risk of death after the death of a spouse. Widowhood increases the risk of dying from almost all causes. Research suggests that the predictability of the spouse's death plays an important role in the relationship between widowhood and mortality. Rate of mortality for widows and widowers was lower if they had time to prepare for the death of their spouse, such as in the case of terminal illness like Parkinson's or Alzheimer's. Gender influences the risk of mortality. Men show a higher risk of mortality following the death of their spouse if they have higher health problems. Widowers have a higher risk of suicide than do widows. So kind of in general here, widowhood increases the risk of dying from almost all causes, but it's important to note that the timing of the death, again, going back to that developmental timing, that social clock matters. So if you lose your spouse at 35, it's developmentally different than, or the impact of losing a spouse is different than losing your spouse at 90 and they die from Parkinson's or Alzheimer's. So where you can better opportunity to prepare for that death and kind of process it, etc., and maybe possibly have social support to lean on versus a sudden unexpected death at 35 years old, for example. So the timing, the predictability of a spouse's death matters. And interestingly, there are gender differences wherein widowers, that is men widows, having higher risk for suicide than widows and having higher risk of mortality. And this could be, it's speculated to be associated with the fact that men in general have less social support, less friends, less family, and depend on their spouse for kind of to fill in that gap. And when they lose that spouse, they lose all that supposed social support, and then they thus are now lonely, they are depressed, etc. They're socially isolated, which contributes to a higher risk of suicide following the death of their spouse in men. And let's wrap it up with our final topic, divorcing families. Couples at highest risk for divorce are younger, 20s and 30s. They're married for an average of only about 7 years, have young children, and are poor. Risk factors combine for an unusually high amount of financial and psychological stress, accompanied by new parenthood stress. These couples feel their marriages lack communication, emotional fulfillment, or compatibility. So kind of the idea here is that you're these individuals who are already at risk for a whole host of negative developmental outcomes, then have a child, and thus even more stress is combined, and the stress of your spouse or partner who has a child combining to just create just a huge amount of unusual amount of stress, psychological stress, but in general also they're poorer. So you then have all these new financial obligations and responsibilities, thus contributing to a likelihood of divorce. So a lot of people make the mistake of, oh, I have all these issues before, I'm going to get married and now all my issues will go away. But instead, you're kind of bringing all that kind of baggage with you often, and especially in these individuals who have very little social resources and financial resources. And then they will, have a child with someone similar to them, and then that kind of lack of resources all combines, and instead of having this child or getting married all of a sudden because you have a child, fixing everything, it kind of makes things worse, and then they're less likely or a higher risk of divorcing. Divorce is typically a 1 to 2 year crisis, and there are risk factors associated with divorce in adults, such as depression, psychological distress, and physical health problems. Factors that facilitate a positive adjustment, or in other words, kind of buffer, to divorce: adequate financial support, good parenting by custodial parents, good parenting by non-custodial parents, minimal conflict between parents, additional social support, minimal other changes in personal resources. So having a cordial relationship with the other parent, and if they get or have a boyfriend, girlfriend, or get remarried, having a good relationship with a non-custodial parent, having, again, minimal contact, having social support, and possibly leaving a bad relationship, all contributing to positive adjustments or a higher likelihood of a positive outcome following divorce. And finally, reconstituted families. Within 3 to 5 years after a divorce, 75% of single-parent families acquire a step-parent. About 60% of remarried couples divorce, recurring cycles of singlehood, cohabitation of marriage, conflict, and separation, divorce. 1/3 of adults find remarriage more stressful than divorce. So these are kind of all straightforward here. So kind of in general, within the 3 to 5 years after divorce, the super majority of single-parent families acquire a step-parent. And about 60% of those, a majority of those relationships end in divorce as well. Okay, with all that said, thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have a great week. Thanks, everyone. Bye.